Hello. What the heck is Haxe? Is title of my talk today. And what I'm going to try to do, because I'm such a great salesperson, is to try something that we repeatedly fail at. Try to explain what Haxe actually is. And it's a rather complicated thing, because technically, well, Haxe is a language. It's also kind of a unicorn. It sounds a bit too good to be true, magic and obscure. And it is a language that at least claims, and in fact does, run everywhere. It compiles to JavaScript, C++, PHP, Python, Lua, C, C#, Java, Hashlink, and NicoVM, which are a bit more obscure. Actually, two targets existing mostly for Haxe. And the Flash player, which soon enough will be obscure. And it literally, if you've ever seen anything interesting in programming, Haxe usually does it. Object-oriented programming, functional programming, language-oriented programming, aspect-oriented programming. It has a type system with more features that anyone can explain. Pattern matching, all this kind of stuff. And my favorite thing called macros. It does compile-time metaprogramming. So the problem that you're faced with is when you try to explain Haxe, you basically feel like this guy, like a parody of yourself. You know, it's kind of, it does so much stuff. It's so nerdy. But yeah, okay, let's get through with it. So the first question that you might ask yourself is, if this is so good, why don't I hear about it more often? Why doesn't everybody use it? That's a good question. Well, for starters, we'll look at the people who actually do use it. The first user group is secret services. Not those guys in particular, but as we proudly found out as a community, one of the agencies that actually does this is the FBI. And it turns out that in order to crack a child pornography ring, they developed their own video player, which they put up on some platform, and they were able to track offenders. And some random guy on the internet decompiled the code. This was all in Flash. And then boom, people realized, hey, this is actually Haxe-generated Flash stuff. And everybody was, of course, super proud of that. And there might be other secret services, but nobody can deny or confirm that they use Haxe, of course. Who else uses this? This is something that actually I found out not too long ago. There's a big healthcare, mostly training company, if I understood right what they do. They use Haxe a lot. So they basically make all of these training applications where you can simulate all kind of, basically you have some patient and he goes into cardiac arrest and whatnot. So yeah, some pretty serious stuff actually. And then next to all that is TiVo. Some of you may have heard of that. This was, I think, among one of the big players that first committed to Haxe. And by big, I mean they had a source code base of 1 million lines of ActionScript code. And within, I don't know, was it a year maybe? Half a year? A year? They made it work on Haxe with OpenFL, that you may or may not have heard of. And as a result, their performance got better. A lot of other problems got fixed. A lot of problems, of course, also got introduced, but that's the way life goes. So yeah, one of the first big, I would say, corporate success stories. And of course, one major part of the Haxe community are game developers. I made just a small pick. Floatplay is maybe one of the second enterprises that actually was crazy enough to port 1 million lines of code. Again, seems to be a magic number. From ActionScript to Haxe, that went pretty well. InnoGames is a big German online game thing. They actually made a very smart porting process where they were able to actually keep their ActionScript sources keep editing them, and they built an automated pipeline that would actually produce hex code from that. So they, without any interruption, were able to switch from Flash Player to JavaScript. Motion Twin is the company where Haxe actually originally comes from. I'll talk about them a bit later. Well, that's one reason I included them. The other one was they won some Game of the Year award this year, I think, for best action game or something. Shiro was where the current company of the creator of Haxe, and the Proletariat Games you may not have heard of, but I also included them because actually I think 2 years ago or something, they were the ones who started strongly using the Unreal Engine, and as far as I understand, not so much into game development, but they were the first ones who actually made it possible to have live code reloading for a general purpose language within the Unreal Engine. That was something pretty amazing because for Unreal you either write C++, then you have to live with C++ compile times and error messages, and or you use this Blueprint graphical interface, which is super nice, but basically if you're a real programmer, then it's useless. So yeah, there's a couple of them. The list, of course, goes on and on and on and on. I hope nobody's offended because I left them out. And there's one last game development programmer. Nobody really sees that. Well, anyway. So this is a screenshot of some laptop, and if you look very, very closely, it looks a lot better on my screen. Okay, this is an uppercase int with an uppercase I, and there happen to be very few languages that actually have this used in game development. And, well, actually, Haxe is the only one, I guess. And the person using this is game developer Barbie. So yeah, so much for Haxe. So back to HackerMan. Okay, there seem to be people using this, but where does this come from? Why doesn't anyone use this? Where is it going? All this kind of stuff. And sometimes it's useful to go to the root. So we're gonna go back, hack back in time, and oh my God! So 15 years ago, which is eternity, there was an interesting environment. So things, I don't know, maybe some people here are younger, so might not have heard of them. Netscape, ICAP was the default browser for Mac. Internet Explorer for Mac was also a thing. PHP 4 with register globals. If you don't even know what that is, don't read about it. It will only make you shit yourself. We had Java applets in the browsers. We had Real Player plugin, VLC plugin, DivX plugin, all this kind of stuff. This was just after the end of the browser wars. So things were wild. And things that were yet to come, basically any big backend framework, Rails, Django, all this kind of stuff, is later than that. Same for front-end stuff, jQuery, XJS, YUI. Google Web Toolkit, if anybody knows that. That was Google compiled Java to JavaScript. That didn't exist yet, and it's gone already. Silverlight, same thing, something from Microsoft. Who cares? JSON was not even a thing yet. The spec was proposed in 2006, and I think the first API serving this was Yahoo in 2005, so 1 year after this. Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, which of course today are ubiquitous, did not exist. Intel Macs, usable desktop Linux, smartphones, mobile internet, all this kind of stuff. Like it's this is the monkey there is actually pretty accurate. There was no Node.js, no JavaScript package managers, no bundlers, nothing. Like this was the fucking dark ages. And of course, Safari and Chrome also did not exist. And in this wonderful time, which gave us this image, came along the concept of very bold people who created rich internet applications, which usually meant, I made this graphic for you with my paint skills and Comic Sans. So basically you had some web server, which had some server-side language, PHP, then dynamic HTML, if anybody still knows that. It was HTML and JavaScript. That was, yeah, this was so great. And then inside there, you had a Flash player. But the amazing thing about this, it was delivering a desktop-like experience on all the platforms. Flash player had a market penetration rate of depending on whom you ask, between 19 and 99.5%. And so you could really, if you wanted to have an editor for something or some drawing tool or all this kind of stuff, you could write this for everyone. Same for games. So yeah, this was pretty amazing. The only problem is that it was a huge pain in the ass. People still thought it's fine because compared to developing the same application for all the different desktop platforms, it was better. But still, browsers were like hell. Same with backend. I mean, there was no frameworks, no nothing. Basically, everybody had everything cobbled together. Programming in 3 different languages was no fun at all. And also even just merely sending around data between the platforms was difficult. Again, no language had JSON in its standard library. You had to do stuff with XML. Some people send around CSVs, all kind of stuff. I mean, this was wild. If you want to get the taste of that, look at the SVG spec, which basically try to encode graphics in XML in an efficient format. It's not XML. And so at this time, basically, at least Wikipedia claims this. This is my source. Motion Twin in late 2003 even started working on a thing called ActionScript meta language, which apparently was ActionScript with types, because at that time ActionScript 1 did not have types yet. And this later then split into 2 different projects. MTask was the first open source ActionScript 2 compiler, which had type support. And everybody with some degree of self-respect doing Flash actually used that thing because it was a lot faster and a lot less bug-free than the official thing. And Motion Type, which remained an internal language for Motion Twin, that actually was also targeting Nico VM, which was a bytecode interpreter meant specifically for the server. So something which was also prototype-based, dynamic. There were also attempts to make Lua run in it and all this kind of stuff, if you're really interested. But main point was to have a platform so that you can use the same kind of code on the server. And in 2006, all of this resulted in Haxe. At the time, it was written with a capital X because that was cool. And so you had one single language to target everything. So to make the HTML Flash and also something on the server. The nice part also was that the JavaScript typings, as they call them, we call them externs, but FlowType and TypeScript called them typings, were stuff that actually worked. So it wasn't too focused on defining the cutting edge stuff. If you wrote stuff against the typings from the standard library, you could be reasonably sure that it actually worked on Opera, Internet Explorer, all this kind of weird stuff. So that was pretty nice. And it allowed for absolutely transparent communication between platforms. Meaning that if there was an object that you had instantiated, for example, on your server in PHP or in, PHP support was not there, but say in Nico or something that lived in JavaScript world, in the Flash world, you could call methods on that other thing as if it were in the same runtime. So this was pretty nice. In some sense, full stack development, I believe this term is from 2010, as it should be. So just to demonstrate it, yeah, this is the awesome Haxe logo. So this was some cool demo some guy did. Why is this not working? Because it's a different, I'm sorry, can I? How do I open this? Okay, let's put this just right here. Haha. Okay, so this was the cool Haxe logo at the time. This is something a bit created a bit later, but basically this is so this is just some slightly interactive thing in Flash, as you can see. Well, you can't see because you don't see the context menu. That's kind of disappointing. Why can't you see that? And why is it stuck? Maybe because it's Flash. Oh, now it's doing something. Okay, it's still not doing that. Well, so how do I show that? Well, this thing is Flash. Sorry? And then in here, we have the same thing implemented in JavaScript on top of Canvas, which basically looks almost exactly the same. So you can, move this around. And then there's this demo. You might see this while it's loading. It has two separate halves, actually, because the color correction used by Flash and the one by JavaScript, by Chrome itself, is different. And basically, as you can see, the two halves move in sync and everything. And that's because it's the same code base compiled twice, once for JavaScript, once for Flash. And in the mixed case, the state just lives in one half of the application, and everything just communicates back and forth. So at the time, there was, pretty amazing, I guess. At least I would think so. So the reaction that you would kind of expect from the market would be, yes, let's do this and only this. What most people did was go back to smashing rocks. Now there's multiple reasons for that. One is, of course, that humans are creatures of habit and it's hard to change and everything. There's a lot of relatively good reasons why this happened. One is there was no major backing behind Haxe, no big corporation. It was basically a one-man show. Like one guy built this thing alone, amazingly. There was a lack of documentation, not so much tooling around. It was a bit too crazy for everyone, I guess. And overall, just pretty Spartan thing. And so that's a bit of a problem. But the good news is that things changed over time. Haxe Foundation was made that actually, from especially some of the people using Haxe, collects funds and allows funding the team. There is a team now. I checked yesterday. Turns out that Haxe has, if you count contributors that made more than 100 commits, then Haxe has 14, and React, for example, has 12. We have a manual now and a cookbook with all kind of exciting recipes and whatnot. Now, IDE support has become a lot better, but the Haxe Foundation itself, the Haxe team, has invested a lot of energy into VS Code support. This is a plugin called VS Haxe, which actually makes it pretty bearable. But it's still a bit crazy, and it's still Spartan. And that's probably a good thing, I guess. But okay, you might ask, now in 2019, there's another language that happens to run everywhere. What's the point of all this? Why do we still need this? And I think there's two parts. There's one which nobody cares about, at least my personal feeling. To have a really good language that has a strong type system, strong metaprogramming, a much faster compiler, I think, at least from people who use TypeScript and Haxe. Constantly get the feedback that with TypeScript, for example, they spend forever. Same for Babel or all this kind of stuff. And it's been around forever, since monkeys were smashing rocks. And the other thing is, it actually produces true native code, and that's pretty interesting. I mean, you have very promising and nice projects like React Native, which have their place. I mean, they're fucking awesome, but still, at some point, this becomes a problem. Airbnb, for example, decided to leave React Native behind because somehow interacting with the native world is a problem. And there's one example project that I would like to note that shows how far you can take things in Haxe. And it's called Haxe UI, and it's something that will take the same code, UI code, and compile it to basically almost any platform right now except iOS. So this is, for example, same code, everything. This is compiled to Linux, Ubuntu, I guess. This is Mac a while ago. This is Windows. But of course, you can compile it to Android. And this is Java code. Like, this is not like React Native, some JavaScript code that runs in some runtime and somehow interfaces through a native bridge. This is really just one thing. And this one is also cute. This one uses PD curses, which I think is a C library in the end. So yeah, it works. And we also use this here at Dockler. And to be perfectly honest, we've been up to a rough start. But we've been at it to maybe just explain what happened, and then how we got out of it, which I think goes toward showing how great Haxe is. We also had this kind of rich internet application, which is one of our most important products. And then things evolved, and people started to rewrite the whole thing in ActionScript 3. But it kind of got over-engineered, suffered the second system syndrome. Everybody tried to do all the good things at once. And the thing is, because it targeted Flash, people didn't really have to pay for it. Flash Player was actually really good at delivering user experiences really fast. It could stream code and execute it and all this kind of really cool stuff. Yeah, that was a bit of a problem that came from that, is that Apple said, like, this whole Flash thing, we're just going to completely kill it off. So the next thing that ensued was total panic. And at some point we said, okay, let's just port this to Haxe. And because there was a tool that also did like maybe 90% of the work, that takes ActionScript, produces hex code from that. So the result wasn't that good. I think after roughly a year, we had one giant JavaScript file that basically just had the core functionality of the thing, and it was pretty buggy and slow. And so the reaction from everybody at the company was pretty horrible, and everybody wanted to just, get rid of Haxe. And it's pretty understandable. I mean, from an objective perspective, the result of the work, as hard as the work may have been, and there were a lot of things to solve. For example, that video streaming on browsers is a joke, whereas in Flash it actually works. And so we made a lot of mistakes. We had a legacy code base right from the start, which is pretty amazing. We did not at all leverage Haxe's strength, because actually Haxe is a language that has a few more features than ActionScript. ActionScript is almost a subset of Haxe, and we passed up a huge opportunity. We used these pretty cumbersome enterprise patterns for even simple things. Like there was simple buttons that had like 6 files around and everything, and we tried to do that. Because until we tried to run it in JavaScript, we never really got the build for that, you know. And it wasn't even really conceived so much as a real web app. In the beginning, it was made as something that compiled to Flash and JavaScript, and so you had a lot of extra complexity and all this kind of stuff. A couple of unfortunate choices made under a lot of time pressure. Shit happens. And so I think while this was underway, I got started at Dockler, and we had a talk. Things that we would actually need to make this nice. So one thing would be a template system, because until then we were just putting stuff together with query selector all and inner HTML. Data bindings that made it easy for, if some data changes here, then some view updates and all this kind of stuff. And some simple mechanism for composing stuff, because before we had a big dependency injection thing going on. It was not always very predictable, just to put it that way. So the plan was, let's make a data layer that if something changes, then everybody can subscribe, all this kind of stuff. Make unidirectional data flow so that you can't get cycles and all this kind of things. We were pretty afraid of that happening. Have some descriptive UI markup so that we don't have to touch the DOM manually all the time. So basically, what we needed was something like React and MobX at the time. But it was not so easy for us to use because, well, one of the reasons was that React is pretty opinionated about how it treats views when it instantiates them, and the dependency injection framework that we had is also very opinionated about when it instantiates things and all this kind of stuff. And to use React from the ground up is probably always pretty easy and nice, and if you can, maybe do it. But if you have like a big imperative code base and you want to switch to React, it's going to be non-obvious. So the implementation was, I created something like JSX for Haxe that could produce both DOM and VDOM, because in the beginning we were still playing around with DOM. Ran through some small virtual DOM library. It's actually called virtual DOM. Some implementation of observables, if somebody knows RxJS, something of that kind, just way smaller and simpler. And then some framework based on top of this that has the notion of UI components and state management and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, basically the full stack to do it. And I named this thing Coconut because, well, it was just a bad joke. And of course, my expected reaction was that the whole team would take it up. And what happened is that many people preferred to continue the old way for many reasons. But actually, our team slowly started to use these things, which was also not really easy. While implementing React in our application was impossible, using Coconut was also not trivial, just because it had a few nice features. And in this time, I think this ranges from August 2017 to now. Our compiled and minified application went from roughly 4 megabytes to 1.2 or something now. And every upward bump that you see is us adding features. And every downward bump is actually cleaning up some of the mess. And so actually, during all this time that the size goes down, we're adding stuff. You know? And I also, using my awesome MS Paint skills, I also added the lines of code in this graph, which we halved in all that time, while adding stuff. So turns out that it was really cool. Now the unfortunate thing, or I don't know, the circumstantial thing is, our company moves to React for pretty obvious reasons. And it's a pretty neat library, but it creates a sort of a divide between us and the rest, like all the other front-end teams that we have. And so what I did was, for this Coconut framework, I actually created a Coconut renderer, which makes it so that UI components from Coconut are actually UI components from React, and you can use React stuff directly in Coconut. All this works. And at least our QA said, and it works, but we're still a bit hesitant to release it. But we might do it within the next month, well, the one after, February. And actually, the transition from what we had before to actually turning on React is roughly 400 lines of code changed, and a code base of 55,000 lines of code. Now you may ask yourself, how easy will it be to switch from, say, React to Vue, if that becomes the new hot thing in JavaScript? It's probably going to be a lot more bloody than that. And I would like to propose this as a point to illustrate Haxe's strength. And one of the remaining things I just briefly wanted to touch is that's really good in Haxe is that you can teach the language concepts and speak in those concepts and be very declarative, and that's why it actually becomes easy to swap out, say, some differ against React, against Vue, against whatever. And there's this notion of language-oriented programming, which is basically from the 70s, from Lisp. You can teach your compiler about the language that you have. I'm just going to use one very simple example. This is some library I did, which actually just embeds the semantics of CSS selectors into the language. So for example, you see that this selector queries an input, and because the result is going to be an input, you have this value as number property defined, which you would not find on a hyperlink, for example. It knows that. It can autocomplete. Nothing in the IDE had to be changed. We only had to teach the compiler. The compiler provides autocompletion to the IDE. The compiler will validate that this stuff makes sense. And it will, for example, also, if you mistype form in this case, then it tells you that from is not a known tag. And all this stuff you can teach the compiler. You can really, all this manual work that you have to do in many other languages, you can do in Haxe. And that's pretty amazing. if you compare it to say TypeScript and FlowType, they actually have more expressive type systems, at least for certain cases. But you can't extend them this way, that you would say a string has to have this certain kind of format to be valid and meaning. So yeah, I hope that we will take all of this, a lot further into the future, because there's way more things to be explored, way more things that we can teach the compiler and make our life easier. And in the end, it's time to spread the love. This is why we have this event today here. As most of you hopefully know, Dockler became one of the strategic partners of the Haxe Foundation. We made the Haxe Summit in Amsterdam a year and a half ago, which was, I think, up to date, the biggest Haxe event that existed. And I think Haxe can benefit a lot from Dockler and the other way around. And well, everybody not from Dockler can also benefit from Haxe. That's basically all I have to say about Haxe and what it is. Thank you.